Dr. Rana, what exactly is origin of life research? What is that whole field? Help us.
Yeah, well, as the name implies, it's the quest to try to understand where life comes from, how life originates. And so the idea is that at some point in the history of the universe and the history of the earth, life came into being. And so when you use the term origin of life, another term that you might see flying around oftentimes is abiogenesis, which literally means life coming from non-life. Or you might hear the term chemical evolution being used, where scientists would argue that a large complex ensemble of chemicals self-organized into the very first life forms. And what scientists are referring to when they talk about the origin of life is the origin of the very first cells. So you're talking about single-celled organisms, nothing more complicated than that.
So why are you interested in this? What's fascinating about it to you?
Well, I'm a biochemist by training, and that's my professional interest as well in life's work. And biochemistry is looking at the molecules that make up the cell, how those molecules are structured, how they interact with each other to form the structures inside the cell, how those molecules are involved in carrying out different processes that are necessary for life to exist. And so if you're studying these systems, which are incredibly complex and incredibly elegant systems, of course, out of curiosity, if nothing else, it's interesting to note where on earth do these systems come from.
Right.
And the evolutionary paradigm would argue that these systems emerged, in a sense, all on their own through the outworkings of chemistry and physics, where, again, these molecules kind of self-organized, and as a result, over a vast period of time, the very first cells emerge, and then these cells evolve to give rise to all life that we know of throughout Earth's history.
Well, let's continue on that track. You brought it up. What is exactly the naturalistic approach to this question, the origin of life? How is it approached in general?
Well, instead of saying that life stems from the work of a creator, which would be part of a biblical worldview,
right.
Many in the scientific community argue that, again, life's origin is simply the outworking of the processes of nature, that God is not necessary, an intelligent agent is not necessary to explain where life comes from. It just simply evolves all on its own. And so it's an idea that is mechanistic in nature, where, again, no intelligence is playing a role whatsoever.
Now, Fuzz, you are answering these questions so quick, I actually think we have time to take a brief rabbit trail. I didn't know you were going to be so concise, so I didn't tell you I was going to put...
I can meander and
no, you're doing great.
And go on if you want me to.
So let me ask you this, because I think this might be a good time to do this. We're mainly going to be discussing your book, Origins of Life, but you have another book called Creating Life in the Lab, which actually we're going to be giving away, courtesy of Reasons to Believe, a wonderful ministry. I encourage people to check out the website, look at your beautiful mugshot, all that. We're going to be giving away some copies of that book. The things you just mentioned, the naturalistic approach to the origin of life, how does that relate to these synthetic sort of experiments, creating life in the lab experiments, and how does that work actually as an apologetic for what the RTB model is? I don't know if you can do that one as brief. Let's take a little rabbit trail and kind of give us the thesis of your book and how it relates to this topic, please.
Well, when scientists are trying to understand how the origin of life happened using, again, this chemical evolutionary mindset, one of the things that they do is they go in the lab and they do chemistry. They take molecules and see how those molecules react, hoping that they'll produce biologically interesting compounds that they believe gives insight into the different steps that would be required to go from simple molecules to the very first cells. And this is called the bottom-up approach to understanding the origin of life. Well, as we've learned more and more about life and how it's structured at a basic level, many scientists believe that we know enough information now that we can actually build life on our own in the laboratory. And in a sense, what these scientists are doing is they're starting with simple molecules and getting them to react and interact with each other to try to form synthetic cells. And so the activity or the enterprise in what's called synthetic biology, again, the quest to make artificial life in the lab, is very similar to what origin of life researchers do. And people believe that, hey, if we can make life in the lab, that'll help us understand the origin of life. And people working on the origin of life think, hey, if we can understand how life evolved, maybe we can create it on our own. And so the two activities are kind of intertwined. But what's remarkable is we've learned from the work in synthetic biology that you have to have intelligent agents in order to create life in the lab.
That's the key.
That's right. The molecules just don't assemble on their own into life, but rather you've got highly intelligent, highly trained scientists with a tremendous amount of knowledge, developing sophisticated strategies and protocols to do even the most minute step towards assembling artificial cells. And again, if it wasn't for the involvement of intelligent agents, life could not come from non-life. And so by extension, when we think about the origin of life and chemical evolution, what we learn in synthetic biology, it suggests to us that really life on Earth must have originated from the work of a creator, in spite of what many in the scientific community say.
And so people can find out more about that in your book, Creating Life in the Lab, How New Discoveries in Synthetic Biology Make a Case for the Creator. And like I said, we're going to be giving away some copies of that book. The way to be involved with that contest is if you either go on iTunes and leave us a review, or if you go on the backpackradio.com website and add a comment there, or if you go on the blog, backpacktruth.com, and leave a comment there, and then tell us that you did so in any of those forms, or even on our Facebook page or a Twitter response, and we'll enter you into the contest. So, Dr. Fuzz, when we come back, what we're going to do is talk about some really famous origin of life experiments, the Miller-Urey spark discharge experiments. You're going to help break those down for us, why they're important, and what it all means. Origin of life research with Dr. Fazale Rana. Dr. Fuzz, can I do one thing real quick?
Sure,
This whole show's genesis, to use a pun, actually began on Facebook. I was talking to a friend of an atheist friend kind of thing online, and here's what he said to me. You don't have to tie this in if you want, but I want you to hear how this is tossed about in sort of common conversation, and then let's break down about the Miller-Urey stuff. Here's what he says to me. Starting with the Miller-Urey experiment I posted above, which if you aren't familiar, didn't read it, won't read it, can be summarized as absolutely showing that amino acids, which are the building blocks of all current known life, would spontaneously occur in Earth's atmosphere out of inorganic molecules. This shows that the beginnings of life can spontaneously occur without metaphysical forces. What do you refute specifically about this research that could make it fairy tale-like, or any of the subsequent research that began in the 60s and continues today along the same line of thought? I realize this isn't evolution, but I'm trying to keep it simple, so starting at the beginning versus diving into a topic that most people know very little about unless they dedicated 4+ years of study to it. He has a degree, and this is what he's referring to. But continue on with that as the backdrop to see people actually do talk about these things when they talk about God or not God type stuff.
Yeah, sure thing. Well, you know, this experiment, though people may not be familiar with the term Miller-Urey, they probably are familiar with the experiment if they've taken a high school biology class and even paid a little bit of attention during the class, because when it comes to the section on evolution that's taught in typical high school biology courses, people, of course, are trying to argue in those courses that life originates through evolutionary means. And the idea here is that life comes out of a prebiotic soup, and that soup was created through chemical reactions happening on the early Earth. And to demonstrate that this is possible, textbooks will cite the famous Miller-Urey experiment done in the early 1950s by Stanley Miller and his research advisor, Harold Urey. And what they did is they assembled this glass apparatus in the laboratory. They had in the bottom flask water boiling, which was to simulate the early ocean. They evacuated all the oxygen out of the apparatus. They infused hydrogen and methane and ammonia in the headspace. They had this continuous electrical discharge that presumably represented lightning on the early atmosphere. The gas was presumably the gases found on early Earth. And it's true, lo and behold, a few days later, amino acids form and other molecules as well that are interesting for the origin of life. And so people take this as validation of the idea that life could evolve all on its own apart from the work of a creator. Because amino acids are very important compounds. They are the building blocks of proteins. And so people take this, again, as very important evidence supporting chemical evolution or abiogenesis or the origin of life. Well, it turns out that when Miller and Urey did this experiment, they used an atmosphere that everybody thought was the atmosphere of early Earth. But since that time, we've learned a whole lot about what the early Earth would have been like, and it turns out that the atmosphere of the Earth wasn't made up of hydrogen and methane and ammonia. Instead, it was made up of carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water. And in that gas mix, nothing happens. If you take that gas mix and use it in the Miller-Urey experiment, nothing happens. Nothing gets formed. And so the point here is that the Miller-Urey experiment, though interesting, though clever, it's irrelevant to the origin of life question because it's not modeling the conditions of the early Earth. And so even though it shows up in biology textbooks, it's not a legitimate piece of evidence for abiogenesis or chemical evolution.
Yeah, so I actually asked my friend that I was dialoguing with, I said, how did they know what the initial conditions were? Because otherwise the whole exercise is irrelevant. And he says, I answered your question, start with reading James Hutton, and then read the next couple centuries of literature having to do with scientific development. And then he went on to say, just so this doesn't turn into a semantic thing, the current experiments collect the amino acids and identify them through mass spec and a high-performance liquid chromatography, both techniques based heavily on applicable physics, by the way. So if I read Hutton, will he show that you're wrong?
No, not at all, because, again, Harold Urey was one of the pioneers in terms of understanding what the atmosphere of planets consisted of, and we were getting measurements of the atmosphere in his day of Saturn and Jupiter, and they were made up of hydrogen and methane and ammonia, and so by extrapolation they assumed that's what the atmosphere of early Earth would have looked like as well.
Okay.
And it very well could have been that was the case, but very quickly, because of sunlight hitting the surface of the Earth, the ammonia and the methane would be broken down into nitrogen and carbon dioxide and water, and the hydrogen would evaporate away from the atmosphere because it was so light. It wouldn't be gravitationally retained. And so that original atmosphere would be replaced with a new atmosphere made up of water, nitrogen, and CO2. And so Urey and Miller were correct in some respects, but they were wrong in terms of assuming that atmosphere would hang around in that state very long. And so as we've learned about the different processes that would be in play in the atmosphere, we know that what Miller and Urey did was not relevant to the origin of life. And so in my books, both Origins of Life and Creating Life in the Lab, I give documentation in the original scientific literature to this change in mindset that has happened over about 40 years of work on the conditions of the early Earth. So in a sense, your friend who was throwing those challenges at you was doing a lot of bluffing and a lot of posturing, because it doesn't matter if you're using very sophisticated chemical instruments to detect the amino acids. Nobody's disputing the amino acids formed in Miller's experiment. It's just the question is it relevant to what would have had to have happened on the early Earth?
Dr. Rana, even if the atmosphere was the one of the early Earth, does that in itself preclude intelligent design?
No, that's a very, very good point. Not necessarily, because once you have amino acids that are present on the early Earth, you're a long way from life at that point. You just have a few of the building blocks of a few of the molecules that make up life. You've got to go from those molecules to, again, the very first cell. And every step on in that process is riddled with problems.
So just because something might even be possible doesn't mean it's probable, much less that it actually happened that way.
No, not at all. That's exactly a very good point. And, we do know that the reaction that Miller discovered in his experiments does have some importance, because we do find amino acids in meteorites. And these amino acids that are in meteorites, which are believed to be the oldest materials in the solar system, clearly must have formed within the meteorites, because we know that they're not due to biological contamination when the meteorites hit the Earth. At least some of them are not due to contamination because of their chemical signatures. It's a kind of an involved discussion. And so the way to explain where those amino acids come from is probably the reaction that Stanley Miller discovered in his experiment. And so it's not that chemistry is impossible, but it's not possible on the early Earth, at least based on what we know now about the conditions of the early Earth.
Dr. Rana, let us interrupt you there. We'll be back after the break with more on this very interesting topic.
We're bringing in a conversation I had with a friend on, yes, Facebook. But
How much time do you spend on Facebook?
Well, I only, if I find an opportunity that seems like could be a valid apologetic endeavor, I'll engage. That's actually mainly what I really kind of use it for, that and posting sort of articles or things I find important.
Good
when I first was on there, I'd waste my time saying, I'm eating ramen noodles, but I kind of got away from that pretty fast, and I use it as a different vehicle now. And, sometimes some things are helpful, such as the whole reason I wanted to do the show is directly from that. And so, Dr. Rana, when I brought up some of the stuff we're talking about, we continued on back and forth, and I asked him about two key things that I thought were key. Help me out in here. I'm okay to be critiqued, but I thought it was relevant from what I could read and what I could gather, that you had to have proteins from these experiments that could reproduce. They had to be self-replicating, and these weren't, and that's problem. And then I went on to write, to make matters worse, these spark discharge experiments do not produce cytosine. Is that how you pronounce it?
You pronounce it cytosine.
Cytosine, yeah.
But your points I think are valid points, and very good points that you made, because one of the key properties of life is the ability to replicate. And so in order for a cell to replicate, the molecules inside the cell have to undergo some form of replication, or at least some of them do. And it's true that scientists can go in the lab and produce self-replicating molecules, proteins, self-replicating RNA molecules. But when you look at these systems, they are elegantly designed systems that don't just emerge all on their own. In fact, the amount of cleverness is astounding when you look at how scientists go about producing these self-replicating systems. So not only is it hard to envision how self-replication would emerge, but it also, when you look at what it takes to make self-replicating molecules, that's evidence for design. And to your point about cytosine, well, this is a key component in another important molecule called DNA, and another related molecule called RNA. And prebiotic simulation experiments done in the lab fail to produce cytosine, and therefore it's hard to envision how it would have been available on the early Earth. And so if this isn't available, one of the key building blocks of DNA isn't available, again, this throws the monkey wrench in the evolutionary explanation for life's origin.
So you have a missing ingredient. You're trying to make cake. You're trying to make a cake without batter or something like that. That's one kind of way to put it. And then the other thing is, you're saying, oh, look, we've got life, but the problem is you have life, in a manner of speaking, that can't reproduce. So even if you sort of did have some life that you could say, look, the first life, well, it kind of stops there, because it has to be able to reproduce, or else that's the end of the road. So, I mean, we only have a minute left, but wrap up that, because when we come back, what we're going to do is actually get in a little bit of the models that you've laid out in some of your work and discuss how that's relevant to this whole origin of life question, especially this, number 6, life's chemistry displays hallmark characteristics of design. And that may even delve slightly into another book you've written called The Cell's Design. So we're going to kind of wrap all that up and say, okay, here's what I think is a better predictive model. Does that sound good? I mean, what can people look forward to on the other side of the break, Dr. Rana?
Well, we've been critiquing evolution. We're going to now talk about the positive evidence for a creator's fingerprint in biochemical systems.
Excellent. I think you have a future in podcasting. See you on the other side of the break, ladies and gentlemen.
Let's use the remaining our time to talk about cell design, your statement that life's chemistry displays a hallmark characteristic of design. How does, just talk about that and tell us how that cell design speaks to a creator.
Sure thing. Well, if we believe that life stems from the work of a creator, then it's reasonable to expect that when we study life, it's going to display evidence for design. And this would be true for the biochemical systems that comprise the cell itself. And so that's what I take a look at in the cell's design. And one of the things that I find really mind-boggling as a biochemist is that when we look at the cell and the chemical systems inside the cell, their defining features are the same as those features that we would recognize as the work of a designer, as a human designer. So when human beings create something, when we make something, whether it's an object or a device, or we put together a system of some sort, those things that we produce have certain features that indicate that these are the work of a mind. William Paley, the great British natural theologian in the late 1700s, said when you look at a watch looks like it's made by a mind, by a watchmaker, and a watch is different from a rock. Because when you look at a rock, we can explain a rock through the outworkings of natural processes, but a watch requires a mind to explain it. And when you look at biochemical systems, they look much more like what you'd expect from a watch as opposed to a rock. And I believe that provides powerful evidence, again, for the work of a mind, and necessitates the idea that life stems from a creator.
So this may be jumping to where you don't want to go, so if it is, just tell me. But explain to us the concept, the importance, how this relates to what we're discussing, the whole idea of self-assembly. What's the relevance, if indeed it is, and I believe it is, of self-assembly to this discussion?
Well, okay, I think it is very much relevant because evolutionary biologists would say that over time, eventually molecules will self-assemble into the very first cells, into the very first life forms, all on their own, apart from any kind of involvement of an intelligent agent. But when we look at biochemical systems, they do not look like they have been self-assembled, but rather they look like they're the product of a mind. We've been talking about amino acids. Well, amino acids are the building blocks of molecules called proteins. And proteins are the workhorse molecules of life. They carry out virtually every activity inside the cell. And even the simplest cell has to have several thousand different types of proteins working collaboratively to carry out all the operations needed for life. But when we study these proteins are functioning like molecular-level machines. And so many of the proteins inside the cell literally look like machines that we would build. For example, there are machines that have rotors and stators and drive shafts and bushings and springs and hinges and lever arms. These are, part of the molecular landscape inside the cell. And when you look at those types of systems, we know from experience that motors and machines don't self-assemble. It rather takes the work of a mind and a pair of hands, of course, to assemble those machines. Well, when we see those same types of characteristics permeating the cell, that to me is evidence for design. Or nobody would ever say that a computer system just self-assembled or software just self-assembled. But when we look at the cell, the heart of biochemistry is built around information systems that literally operate just like computer systems.
All right, so let's go back to this discussion I had. I think this is the right time to bring this in. I gave my friend a quote from Professor Klaus Doss, I believe is how you pronounce it. And here's what he says in an article he wrote called The Origin of Life. I'm only going to read one sentence. I quoted a longer sentence. But he said, "At present, all discussions on principal theories and experiments in the field," and he's talking about origin of life research there, "either ends in stalemate or in a confession of ignorance." And here's what my friend said to that. He said, "That quote from Doss is entirely inaccurate. More modern, precise experiments have produced over 40 amino acids by adding gases that were not added to the original experiment, versus the original 25, I believe. Don't remember exactly. And since only 20 are necessary for organic life, I believe you can extrapolate the rest. So where is the stalemate he speaks of? The original apparatus for the experiment in 52 continues to function to this day." What do I do with that?
Well, I believe that what Klaus Doss said is absolutely correct, and it does characterize the sentiment of origin of life researchers who are desperately trying to explain the origin of life again through evolutionary means. And what's going on here is that it's true scientists can go in the lab and they can do all kinds of interesting experiments that demonstrate in principle, and this is a key point here, in principle, the chemistry and the physics needed to generate life exists. And they can go in the lab and they can work out mechanistically how all these different processes are working, and they can understand them in exquisite detail. But this is not sufficient to explain the origin of life. What you need ultimately is to show that chemistry can happen under the conditions of the early Earth. And literally for every step of the process in the origin of life, even though we can show in principle the chemistry is possible, as soon as we try to translate it to the conditions of the early Earth, the chemistry no longer operates. It's not productive. This was the problem with the Miller-Urey experiment. This is the problem when you try to explain where RNA building blocks come from or how RNA molecules would assemble on clay surfaces. You can show it in the lab, but that chemistry is so finicky, it will not work on the early Earth. The only way it works is you have an organic chemist giving oversight to the process, controlling the conditions, setting up the right ratio of reactants, stopping the reaction at the right time, so that side products don't wind up producing. And this is what Klaus Doss is referring to, is that it ends in stalemate, and people have to throw up their hands and say, we really don't know how it happened, because again, there's no shortage to experiments that have been done, but it's wrong to conclude that those experiments are somehow explaining the origin of life. They're showing in principle what's possible, but you have to translate that to the conditions of the Earth, and when you try to do that, everything falls apart.
What about the work, Dr. Rana, of Robert Shapiro? How relevant are his critiques? How much weight do they hold in this origin of life research field? I saw his name come up again and again when I looked into this stuff, but help guide me. What about Robert Shapiro?
Well, Robert Shapiro died a couple of years ago now, but he was a longtime member of the origin of life research community, very well respected, and did a lot of very good work critiquing many of the different origin of life scenarios, again showing that what's done in the lab is no bearing on, again, what happens on the conditions of the early Earth. And so he provided devastating critiques of many of the sacred cow ideas that are part of the origin of life research community. In fact, garnered the nickname Dr. No. And I was actually at an origin of life conference where Dr. Shapiro was there. I got to know him as a result of being at that conference, and he and I maintained contact off and on until the time of his death. So I knew him personally, And Dr. Shapiro was in the audience listening to a presentation of a researcher talking about how RNA molecules could assemble on clay. And again, it's the same thing we've been talking about. Works in the laboratory would never work on under the conditions of early Earth. And Shapiro, during the Q&A session, said, if you've done anything, you've demonstrated evidence for intelligent design, because, again, the researcher involvement was so extensive that the experiments would not have been successful if it wasn't for the work of those chemists being, again, actively involved in the experimental rig.
That wasn't very kosher of him to do that.
Oh, no. There was a lot of people that were sucking their teeth when Shapiro made that statement. But the fact of the matter is he was correct.
The episode of Big Bang Theory where one of the guys goes to some scientific conference and reads a paper, and the guys are roommates, so they're sort of at odds, and they end up fighting. They have a big old physical fist fight during the presentation, like slapping each other like little kids. It was just funny. I'm not recommending people watch that show, but I do remember that scene. Okay, let's finish with this if we could, Fuzz. Someone turns on the TV, and they see bubbling ooze. They see a man with beakers, white lab jacket. Or they open up the newspaper or go online and it says, we've created life in the lab and all those kinds of things. Give us sort of, how do we need to be thinking about that as Christians? Wrap it up. Next time I hear something, can you give me a 1 minute and a half summary of the way I need to kind of process it as sort of a layperson? What do I do? Because it seems intimidating, What do I do?
Well, you have to realize that when those types of claims are being made, when that type of information is being presented, it's always being presented with a certain worldview in play, namely the worldview of naturalism, which says there is no God. And so people are presenting these findings or this information from an evolutionary perspective. And it's possible to look at that same information from a Christian worldview and see that it not only challenges the evolutionary paradigm, but it provides positive evidence that, again, life must stem from the work of a creator. It's a worldview issue oftentimes, and you got to tease away the data from the worldview.
All right, well, that's helpful. So you're getting back to really the assumptions underlying the worldview. And so it's probably presented certain because they don't really have another option. But what you're saying at RTB is there is another option, and it's a much better predictive model.